Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention, please. It is my great pleasure to welcome you at the debate we're having on a new book by Professor Clifford Angell Jr. entitled The Centrality of the Regime for Political Science. If I were to describe this work very briefly, just in a couple of words, I would say that this is an intellectually inspiring proposal to reconcile the tensions within the modern political science and overcoming the crisis that is arguably witnessed within political science with the help of classical political philosophy. To flesh out the problem even more bluntly, the book tries to use political philosophy to bring the regime back in.
Don't speak into the mic too close, so you're breathing right into it, sir.
Okay.
Boom, boom, boom.
To bring the regime, so to say, back in, and therefore create some sort of reconciliation between the warring paradigms of behavioralism that brought the actors back in and the new institutionalism that brought the state back in. So Clifford here is bringing the regime back in. Of course, this is just a modest proposal. I know the author is working on a more extensive work. However, the direction seems to be, or the aim seems to be, to move in a direction of a new, more organic typology, quote-unquote organic, of political forms, which in the modern world is absolutely necessary and which would present the modern state as just one of the many possibilities of a political form. Now, of course, this would arguably at some point lead us to a more comprehensive typology, maybe even taxonomy of political forms, which, as we know, is something that is present in natural sciences such as biology, sadly not in political science. Political science still is a battlefield of different paradigms and different classifications of regimes and political forms. Professor Clifford Bates is a political philosopher and a political scientist. He earned his BA in political science from Providence College in Rhode Island, MA in politics from the University of Dallas, studying with Mel Bradford, among others, and his PhD in Northern Illinois. He is interested in classical political philosophy and how it offers a critique of modern political thought. He is the author of Aristotle's Best Regime, a very well-known book on the subject published by LSU Press. And I am proud to say that he's also my former teacher, mentor, and friend. I hope that all the above are true. Now, in our debate, we will host a number of scholars who agreed to contribute to the critique and maybe cautious praise of Professor Bates's work. We're very grateful for that. Among them, let me greet Professor Stanisław Filipowicz. Professor Stanisław Filipowicz and his PhD from the Institute of Political Science at Warsaw University, where he works currently. He is a distinguished professor at that institution. He wrote extensively on the Polish and American political thought and has done work combining elements of political theory and cultural anthropology. Among his many books and many interesting publications, I personally value Myth and the Spectacle of Power as one of the most interesting works, but there are many others. Let me also welcome, we have two guests from US. Sadly, it's impossible for us to, to English-speaking guests, I wanted to say. I'll clarify this in a moment. Sadly, it's difficult to put this on screen. Among them, let me welcome Professor Stephen Hayward. You hear his voice. Let me say this. We apologize for the technical difficulties. Professor Hayward earned his PhD at Claremont Graduate School. He's a former director of journalism group of the Group for Public Research Syndicate at Claremont Institute. Professor Hayward is a prolific commentator and analyst of American political life. Articles written by him have appeared in Reason, The Weekly Standard, National Review. He also published for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Among his many works, he is the author of a 2-volume biography of Ronald Reagan. Let me also welcome Professor Peter L.P. Simpson. He will also join us in a moment in FEG, maybe not in FEG, but at least we'll hear his voice. Professor Simpson earned his PhD at Victoria University of Manchester, England. That's why I hesitated to call both of our distinguished guests American scholars. He is a professor of philosophy and classics at the City University of New York Graduate Center. He has taught at the Catholic University of America, Washington, D.C., University College Dublin, Ireland, Manchester Polytechnic, United Kingdom, and his most recent book is Political Illiberalism, A Defense of Freedom. Now, let me also welcome Dr. Artur Szutta. Dr. Szutta, from what I have gathered before this meeting, scrambling to finish my notes, works at the Department of Ethics and, please correct me if I'm wrong, and Social Philosophy at the University of Gdansk. His main area of interest is citizenship, multiculturalism, liberalism, personalism, and the reflective equilibrium. His recent book is Civil Disobedience, an attempt at defining the concept, if you translate the title into English. Let me also welcome Professor Tomasz Żyro. Last but not least, the order is alphabetical, and if your name starts with Ży in Polish, then you might find yourself at the end of the list. However, Professor Żyro is a very distinguished author. He earned his PhD at the Institute of Political Science at Warsaw University. He is currently the Dean of the National Security Department at the War Studies University in Warsaw. His major research interests include modern and contemporary political thought, political philosophy, US intellectual history, Polish public debates, and political representation theory. His major works include Ideologia Americana, the sources of political ideas, Politeia, the introduction to politics, so very, very timely because one of the central notions Professor Bates's work deals with is indeed the Greek classical notion of politeia, and Political Will, 7 essays in practical political philosophy. Now, if I may just briefly introduce myself, my name is Michał. I'm a former student of this glorious institution. This is where I earned my MA at the American Studies Center. Then I went on to earn my PhD at Indiana State University, thanks to the tutorship and help of Professor Bates. Let me just be very clear about this. Currently, I earned my PhD in political science. Currently, I work as the assistant professor of political science at Lazarski University. I publish at a number of magazines, and I also do analysis for the Jagiellonian Club Center for Analysis. My recent, so far, the only book is Alexis de Tocqueville, Theory of Democracy and Revolution. Obviously, I deal with comparative politics and political theory.
You're breathing too hard into the microphone.
Yes, I got nervous when I was talking about myself. So, yes, so
Sign that you are still alive.
okay, so now let me quickly pass on the floor to our distinguished guests. They will make short speeches, comments on Professor Bates's work. If we could limit ourselves to about 10 minutes for each presenter in the first round.
You want to go Steve first, then we can do people here, and then we can
So
Peter last, maybe. If you don't mind, Peter.
We're starting with Professor Hayward, yes?
Yeah, Stephen Hayward.
Okay, so we're starting with Professor Hayward then. Please, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Let me know if my sound is too low or too loud or whatever, and I will try to make adjustments here on my end.
Can you hear him back here? Okay.
I can hear you guys just fine. Can you hear me okay?
They hear you fine.
Okay, good. Then I will proceed. I've scribbled down a bunch of notes here that I hope I can put into some kind of coherent whole. The first thing I want to say is congratulations, Cliff, on an extraordinary book. I've never read a book that's only 95 pages long that is so rich in thought and detailed and wide-ranging all at once. And I'm simply overmatched by it, I have to say. It humbles me and making me realize how rusty I am on my Aristotle, whom I haven't really studied closely for too long now. But also, I'm not familiar, as I should be, with a lot of the modern literature on comparative politics that you do a wide-ranging tour through. I haven't read Dahl and Huntington and Allman and some of the other leading figures as carefully as you have. In fact, some of them I haven't read at all. So that's a defect on my part. But I'll give you my headlines about this and hopefully throw out some thoughts for discussion and debate, I suppose. One is that although I did not need to be persuaded of this, but I thought that the book is a wonderful vindication of the proposition that Aristotle is still the best political scientist who ever lived and that we ignore him at our peril. And that notwithstanding whatever gaps need to be filled in, whatever changes in human consciousness that you may wish to point to, that leave his account perhaps incomplete or wanting an additional thought, I still think it's a problem that we ignore him in modern political science. The second point is I really appreciated the discussion toward the beginning on the problem of how we render politeia in English, right? You had very good discussion of how of the defects of both regime as a term or constitution as a term. Regime for its negative connotations, and then constitution for its formal legalism. And I'll say that when I talk to students about the Constitution, because that's what I teach most often is the American Constitution and constitutional law, I try to illustrate this point by talking about the way we also use the word Constitution in a way that's not political at all. My favorite example is the older gentleman at the club who tells his other gentlemen while they're waiting for their whiskey that this morning I had a thought while I was out on my morning constitutional. But what's that about? The person's going out for a walk because it's good for digestion and it clears your mind and you get to think of things. But that's constitutional in something I think that approaches the same sense of the way of life that we sometimes render politeia if we put a little bit differently than regime, still less constitution. I'll add that for the benefit of people there and our Polish friends who are present, maybe one of the problems with political science today that is raised in numerous places in the book is what might be called the disunity of the social sciences, right? I mean, we split off sociology, economics, and psychology into separate and more narrowly inwardly focused disciplines. And there's some reasons for that, of course. But then there's the divorce from the humanities. In a lot of political science departments, including UC Berkeley, where I currently am visiting, political theory and political philosophy is hanging on for dear life against a lot of sentiment that it really ought to be exiled once and for all to the philosophy department, which would be a great mistake. And that's happening in a number of leading research universities that I've learned about and can tell you about. And maybe one way of understanding the disarray of political science in American universities is to point out something that I don't know if it happens in the same way in European universities or in European languages or not, but if you look at American universities, you'll often find 3 different names for the departments that study political life. At Dallas, and I think at Northern Illinois, where Cliff took his advanced degrees, you have a department of politics.
No, it was political science.
Was it political
It was
science?
political science.
Really? I'll be darned, that's too bad. Well, that's another name, Steve. Because a lot of universities, it's Department of Political Science.
At LSU, it's political science.
LSU too.
At LSU, okay. But then it's still other American universities. It's not politics or political science. They are departments of government.
Yes.
And even though the curriculum is often the same, you'll find that just the names show a slightly different disposition as to what the purpose of the discipline is. Government suggests an actual practical orientation of teaching people how to rule, right? Whereas political science is increasingly scientific. Cliff talks in the book about the behavioral evolution and so forth. So let's see, a couple other comments here. There's a couple, let's see, there's a couple of places where I haven't really got this mastered as well as I ought to for my brief here, but Clifford talks about how, we'll find it on page 36, about the, I want to get this exactly right, about the dynamic nature of the politeia, right? The ontological state of contingency, as Cliff puts it. The coming and going of regimes, right? The things aren't static, things are constantly changing. And as an observer of American politics, what constantly preoccupies me is trying to figure out why certain political practices and political norms have changed. Even though the formal legal structure or our Constitution hasn't changed a bit. Not to get off too much on the contemporary matters, but right now, the United States Senate is convulsed about whether we get rid of filibuster, this rule of a supermajority to end unlimited debate. That's been a long-standing practice whose usage has changed dramatically in the last 25 years to the point now where we're saying we have to get rid of it. And it's often conservatives now who would have defended the institution, who are in the vanguard of saying we should get rid of it. How did this come to pass? That's a long subject, of course, but it's a good example of the state of contingency of a regime and how their norm practices change. Finally, Cliff talks a lot about the coming and going of behaviorism in political science. And what I see most often today is, I'm not sure I would call it post-behaviorism. Instead of today, the dominant mode of political science in the leading universities is modeling and regression modeling and finding instruments for measurement. That's actually the phrase that's used in the weekly workshops on political methodology I attend, mostly out of perverse curiosity at how far you can misunderstand political life. And what you find is that we have a whole cast of political scientists today who, if they find an instrument, which means some kind of data set is what that really means, then they're in business, and they try to measure something. And so the broader idea of political life, the character of social relations, and the other kinds of questions that Aristotle places front and center are simply ignored. And a lot of political scientists have nothing to say about it. And that connects, by the way, with declining enrollments in political science in American universities, which I think is kind of crazy to think about. But that's where things are going today. And maybe I'll just end with a comment that's 40 years old now, but it was the great Harvard political scientist Edward Banfield who anticipated the state of political science today when he wrote an essay, a famous essay, Policy, Science, and Metaphysical Madness, great title. And he said in there, does anyone think that the framers who wrote the American Constitution in 1787 would have produced a better work if they had an entire staff of model builders to advise them in the process? And I think the answer to that is an obvious no. But that's where we are, and so I'm glad to hear that Cliff is working on a longer version of this book, because this purposely rich book is, I think, a preface to something even bigger and better. I'll stop there, and you can move on to someone else in the queue.
Okay. Yes, let me just say that this has also been my experience when I took methodology classes. I had to do a regression, and eventually I did this, obviously. Well, let us now pass to Professor Simpson. Are we ready?
No. He's last. He'll be
He's
last.
last. He'll be last.
Yeah.
So now, Professor Filipowicz, yes? Okay.
All right.
So if you would.
Thank you. Oh, it doesn't work. It works? Yeah. Okay, so it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation, of course. The book, well, I'm still impressed. I think it's a marvelous example of this form of academic activity that can bring us a new hope, I'd say. Really, probably I'm saying all this word because I'm, well, the person being in the margin of political science. I do not consider myself a political scientist. Well, how can I explain my point of view? Science is about thinking, thinking is about understanding or misunderstanding. And I think the book we are talking about today is a fabulous example of how not to be, not to fall the victim of this misunderstanding that comes with our ambition to create a powerful formulas, patterns of understanding. So the book, I think, offers something very exceptional. It's, of course, it's concise, but it's something very precisely crafted and offering a very deep insight into very complex matters. And I think this is the most interesting aspect and the most rewarding characteristic of this achievement, which I admire, I must say, because it is really something that should be placed in the center of our attention. Today, in the largely understood of political science, political studies, we see here the whole spirit, the whole history of human spirit, starting with the drama mythology, going through all this process of remodeling of the patterns of our political thinking, to end up with a very important questions, fundamental and very essential questions concerning political thinking and the responsibility of those who are engaged in academic teaching and providing the sort of knowledge. What sort of knowledge and what should we envisage as a necessary means of our cautious, not to be the persons who invites this uncertain knowledge of a sort of chaos. And the most important problems I would like to address shortly, trying to concentrate on some very important matters I see as crucial in the study delivered by Professor Bates. From my point of view, the most important question, if we are coming back to the past, specifically to Aristotle, and we would find something in the past, how do we see this new perspective of exploiting certain wisdom that is distant, but at the same time can be something entering the field of our own experience? Because thinking, I believe this is a very important aspect of human experience, and thinking about thinking is also something crucial. So I believe that this formula, this question concerning the centrality of certain category, of certain notion, is something that gives us an opportunity to see in a clear way the nature of political thinking in action, And the question, what sort of inspiration have we in view in mind when we consider this return of Aristotle? A purely instrumental one? It means, do we want to set up a new model of belonging to the domain of comparative studies, so to enrich somehow our ability to approach the domain of politics by using some portion of knowledge originating from the study of Aristotle? Or on the other hand, do we want to initiate a new process of widely understood remodeling or thinking about the domain of politics? And this is how I see the virtue of merit of this kind of analysis offered by Professor Clifford, because I think that's a challenge not only for those who are interested in political, in comparative study of politics and using and abusing the notion of political systems. It is basically about thinking about politics and about our ability to remodel our approaches so that we could embrace reality in a proper way, not to be helpless in confrontation with reality. And this is something encouraging, I think, as an example of intellectual decidedness and very challenging. I would like to quote at least one short passage, but it's, I think, something that we should underline here, and the concept of the regime differs from the concept of the state in that the concept of the state is almost of all its permutations looks at the heterogeneous system as dysfunctional, while it's something more complex and something to be understood. And it is very dangerous to think that we have created an all-embracing system of notions that can be applied in the domain of political science, and political science as such already exists. It's still to be invented probably, and I believe that it is very helpful in our effort to find something, new ways to establish new perspectives. So congratulations, this is really very inspirational, very insightful. It's been my great pleasure to read this book.
Yes, I was.
You were shocked.
I was pondering on this very insightful remark about especially noting the criticism of the modern state, which is a running theme in the book. One of the many themes is important, and noting the heterogeneous nature of the classical regime is obviously something that's important for the understanding of this particular work. Now, let me pass on to Dr. Szutta.
I'd like to say hello to everyone here in the room and to our disputants on the other side of the world. I would like to say hello to Professor Simpson, who might not remember me, but we met once upon a time in Liechtenstein in 1994, I guess. I was a young student. And my wife was there, and she wrote her master's on McIntyre thanks to your advice. So thanks from her as well.
You, reminder.
I'm going to say three things on the book. One thing which I would say I strongly agree with Professor Bates. One thing that I'm not quite sure what to think about it, and one critical remark. So the main thesis is, let's go back to Aristotle. We will finally understand the nature of politics. I mean, he gives a device or tools to understand what really happens in political realm and what the political actually is. And this is where I strongly agree. And I would say I like the idea that the political is opposed to oikos, in which the owner, let's say, gives commands and uses whatever he possesses, slaves, wife, children, and so on, which would be a kind of barbaric way of so-called ruling other people, which would not be a political rule. What I like about political, and it's taken from Aristotle, is that speech is being used as the way of communicating, not orders, not commands, but speech. And by speech we could understand using arguments that refer to reasons, and people are able to take those reasons as their own reasons for action, and if they follow what we advise them to do, they do it because we sort of gave authoritative arguments. So politics should be about this way of communicating. If we use coercion, it's only because most of us, or all of us to some extent at least, we are not grown enough. We have no virtue, enough virtue to live in the ideal political society or community. However, the more of a speech, the better for the political. And if we take this feature, the speech, as communicating to be crucial one, then we'll understand that it's not just about the state, it's not just about government, it's not about power. Politics is about the whole political community. And here I have this second point, which I would say I'm not quite sure I agree or disagree. Professor Bates translates politeia into regime, which is, of course, into political sciences quite a common thing, but philosophers do not think exactly the same way as political scientists. I would rather use the word political community all the way through. Of course, you can ask the question, what makes political community political? And then you would say, well, this is the structure, and maybe something more than just the structure, but you would call it regime. You would say there are different constitutions, different regimes, or different kinds of structures that communities, political communities are political thanks to, or thanks to which they are political. But structure sounds something like something passive. And you also mentioned this in your book, that regime understood in terms of just constitution and some legal mechanism or legal structure is not good enough, because we don't have this feel of this full of action, or I would say not passive reality, which politeia is. So I will not, this is where I would ask rather the question than you say something on my own. I would say, why regime? Why not something else, sounding more convincing to a contemporary ear, at least of non-scientific ear? Philosophers are not scientists. They are not going to say they do political science. And now something that I would call a critical remark. Professor Bates, now and then, especially in chapter 3, I guess, where he criticizes contemporary approaches to politics, he mentions things like, especially to Robert Dahl, that when they give their own typology of different regimes, they put some ideological biased elements into those typologies. For example, Robert Dahl distinguishes different political structures, let's say, by saying that some of them have higher or lower level of participation, which is not the same as to say that there are states or politeias in which on the one is in rule, some minority, maybe not in rule, let's say does politics. Some minority does politics or majority. So this criticism, using the term that this is ideological bias, democratic ideological bias, bothers me a little bit. It sounds like Professor Bates wants to do, let's call it comparative political science in a purely descriptive way. But my claim would be that this is impossible. I mean, once you call that something is political, something is not, you already have some normative distinction between something which is better and something which is worse. And now the question is it a kind of bias or not? I mean, can we evaluate things in one way, saying this is not biased, and then refute someone else's distinctions as biased. So I would say, if we come back that political is a normative term, I would say that maybe a good argument could be followed from political to participation. Because I have only 10 minutes, I'm not going to now to say all I could say, but maybe there will be my turn later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that. We're already entering the phase of a more heated discussion. Professor Bates will obviously have time to answer this at the end of the short presentations. Let me just say that I also noticed the problem that you're describing, and I looked at it from a slightly different angle. It seems to be that the main problem in comparative politics is that many typologies assume a certain type of regime as a yardstick for measuring other regimes. So it's like, to quote a famous author, it seemed like a state. For instance, we take the modern state and we look at all political forms from the point of view of the modern state, and then we judge them as either deficient or developed states. But this is definitely a fascinating discussion. Let me now pass the floor to Professor Żyro.
Good evening. In the age of precipitation, it is good to be concise. So, and because of my inherent lack of self-discipline, I'm going to read some comments on Dr. Bates' book. But first of all, I agree with Professor Filipowicz that this book was a kind of refreshing attempt to coming back to the origins, I mean to the Greek origins, which is called in Greek arche. On the other hand, this book made me rethink not only the Aristotle's taxonomy, but also some strange and sometimes unfriendly relationship between political science and thinking about politics. So let me focus on some traits on the book's content. The question of the political takes for granted that the philosophia perennis exists. It is good to see that the problem is ontologically founded upon arche and thus has own beginning. And the reflection about the origins became a part of Greek history. It is worth reminding that this renovation, I would say, of the status of political is due to Carl Schmitt's article, Was ist das Politischen, and it was continued by remarks being written by Basil Strauss. On the other hand, it is Christian Mayer who, in his book, The Greek Discovery of Politics, demonstrates to what extent the Greek tragedy takes a unique place in Greek political history. It voices the Greek understanding of what's the political, and 458 before Christ, when Aeschylus Aristeia was staged, as breaking points for a reflection about the tragic or even tragical dimension of politics. Aristeia still resonates the focal event that's of the depriving of Areopagus of its political power. Generally speaking, Aristeia derives its pathos and respect from the fledgling problem of the political. And the political proclaims for being a central aspect of the whole trilogy known as Eumenides. In the polis, the political substitutes the natural order of things. Dr. Bates had embraced the process in the first chapter, comparing the Aeschylus strategies with the Aristotle's political reflection, to highlight the centrality of political regime for political philosophy. And a point at the part of his contrasting the Aristotelian idea of political regime with the next stages of history is a process of gradual forgetting of the idea from the epoch of Christianity until the modern times. I share some doubts about the adequate reading of the Thomist tradition, but the hypothesis that the political regime was put in oblivion during the modernity is reasonable enough to read chapter 3 and 4. The oblivion of Aristotle is in this aspect, of course, a part of much larger phenomenon of eradicating the Aristotelian Thomist tradition from the main currents of philosophical thought. Interesting enough, in the book, there is no trace of MacIntyre's tremendous effort to describe the process in the Western tradition. This is one of few my critical remarks concerning Clifford-Bates' book. I even dare say that Clifford Bates' interpretation of the Christian mind is too hasty and too brief for putting it under the reasonable scrutiny. I agree with Dr. Bates that the centrality of politeia for Aristotle's politics in the modern political thought wither away. He focused upon three questions: how the modernity has been established by tracing relationship between empires and the political, the Machiavellian invention of the state, and the emergence of the nation. And as we all know, Dr. Bates' political fervor, with which he discusses some ambushes the modernity produced. The first issue gives him an opportunity to argue with contemporary enthusiasts of the concept of empire in the postmodern camp. The second issue raises the question to what extent the state is ready to meet challenges posed by some contemporary processes, the globalization included. The third one leads him to analyzing shortcomings of the idea of political will, which is quite close to my reflections. In the last chapter, Dr. Bates argues with scholars who are responsible for oblivion of Aristotelian concepts in political theory. He deals also extensively with conceptual consequences of this act forgetfulness. Thus, from deliberating the political in the Greek tragedy via framing Aristotle's main political ideas, Dr. Bates enters in the modern world using tools of the history of political ideas and consequently considering main concepts of the contemporary political theory. And as a conclusion, I would like to say that his book delivers good, although short, introduction into main problems of political thinking after putting into oblivion the problem of politeia. The eradicating of the concept of political regime brings forth some intriguing epistemic and ontic problems for the modern political theory, and the story will continue, I hope, during our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Obviously, we all agree, I think, that this book begs for a second part, for a sequel. As far as Thomism is concerned, I have to tell you that after reading Aristotle's West Regime, I know that Professor Bates's approach to Thomism is, to put it mildly, ambiguous. But I'll let him handle that. I mean, Thomism not as such, but Thomism as a way of, or as the only correct way of reading Aristotle. So there's a little bit of criticism there that I anticipate. Now let me pass on the floor to Professor Peter Simpson.
All right. You all hear me?
Yes, we do.
All right, good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you all at distance. I have visited Poland several times, most enjoyable, and it's a pleasure to be here to celebrate Cliff Bates' new book. I should say, to begin with, that the book was so hard for me to get into, partly because it's so rich in its contemporary theory, with which I'm not that clear. But after having gone through it more than once, that's part of it, I think I get an idea of what's going on. And what I find particularly insightful about the analysis, the way in which Aristotle's notion of chaos is being used to help us understand and think. The Polydea as if put out at four.
You're cutting out.
Sorry?
You're cutting out a little bit, so maybe you have to speak near.
I am?
Yeah.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay, so I should be closer to the screen. All right. The Politeia has four elements, four causes: matter, form, efficient, and final. And it is a distinct part of unity. It is not itself like a state, so that in some ways ultimate. And that is enlightening because it helps us understand the difference between politeia and polis. Polis is the community, which for Aristotle is a natural thing. It arises naturally out of a human desire to live, ultimately itself. The politeia is the structure that human beings invent to fashion the polis in a certain way. In particular, to fashion the polis towards achieving a certain goal, which is the goal either of the ruler, if it's one of the deviant regimes, as he called, or the common good of the polis. And the common good of the polis, of course, is virtue. The state, it is totally different. The state is what the people, the nation, create an act of will. Essentially, in order to create a community where they live together in peaceful cooperation. And the political government or the authorities are simply there to serve this cooperative living together. In this way of looking at the situation, there's no place for understanding a politeia and a polis distinction. The state itself is a kind of creation by the people's will. And it does is what out. The difference is the obstacle totally create, as opposed to the later notion deriving from Szutta or another, whereby the state already exists as a evolutionary and historically accidental structure of people come together in some ethnic identity, and they create the state. But I don't think that distinct place quite wrong. Now, if then we take what Clifford is suggesting as a way of looking at political phenomena today, he's saying let's examine contemporary politics, not this view of the state, but from the view of Aristotle's politeia. If we do that, what do we get? Well, Cliff is more proposing that we do it, actually coming up with an analysis of what we get if we. So let me develop what I would be the analysis. So we regard the whatever it is, as the politeia, and the nation, the community, as other. In which case, the government, politeia, now, has to be understood in terms of, and in particular, has to be understood in terms of its
function.
What is the goal of the government? Well, here I suppose we need to question, who is the government? Which is the point about the polytuma, Aristotle's notion. And the government is, or polytuma, is whoever from the larger community has somehow got to the position of exercise control. How do politicians? The answer is they get elected. All right, let's bring it out. So, election is a device of oligarchy. It's not a device of democracy. So, we would have to say that all the modern governments which are elected are oligarchies. What is their goal or their aim? Well, at least in theory, according.
We're frozen. We have a froze. I think.
We have a frozen philosopher.
Peter, there you are.
Yes?
You there? Your internet connection got kicked out for some reason. We lost you and you froze. So you have to repeat that thought you were.
Where did that free?
About a minute ago.
Did you hear when I was saying that if we examine who the polytuma or who the rulers
Yeah, we heard that.
are,
Yeah, we heard that part. And oligarchy, everything's an oligarchy.
Right, so the question then is, what is the goal?
The goal, okay, the goal of the regime. That's when it froze, when you said goal.
Right. Well, the politicians think their goal is the interest of the people. They represent the people.
They represent.
I think this is the goal.
Aristotle is going to say what?
No, yeah, continue. Aristotle's going to say.
Oh, right. That the goal of an oligarch is its own perpetuation in power and control. And all this talk about representation, people, is just obfuscating propaganda. Now, this may sound a bit doctrinal, but especially in Poland, where you have splendid government. But maybe I could discuss this out, especially to and other.
I think the thing is you're breaking up. Your signal is kind of chopping you off. Thinking. So could you just give a wrap up so we can kind of, sorry to interrupt like that, but we're getting to the point where it's just losing you every second for some reason. I think it's a time of day. I think we're hitting that time when the stream is the university decides to sell. You know, the Washington University markets out its Wi-Fi access, so therefore.
No, I have a different explanation. I think this actually is the goal of Richard Rorty. So the moment you start speaking about the goals of the regime, it cuts up the connection.
Rorty's goes. So could you just give us a couple of thoughts on wrapping up the point that you're hitting on?
All right, well, my thought would actually be a question to make you as to the panel. Well, would you agree with my application of your theory to politics that if Aristotle pushes the polity is so high, we will come to the conclusion that all modern state governments are despotic oligarchs?
Okay.
Yes, okay.
No, I think it's my turn now to respond to everyone.
Yes,
I hope.
yes. So now we'll give the floor to Professor Bates. We apologize for the quality of connection. However, let me just point out that Professor Simpson did touch upon a very important issue. He touched upon the issue of the fundamental divide between the world of the politeia and the world of the modern regime, also from the point of view of the difference between politeia and the nation state. If I were to compare this little book to another book that's also not great in the number of pages, but extremely important from the point of view of political theory, I would compare it to In Defense of Nation State by Pierre Menard. And Menard very clearly conflates the modern nation state with the Greek politeia, which is something that Professor Bates absolutely abhors and which he doesn't subscribe to. Now let me give the floor to our distinguished author.
I think I have to have the mic. I hope not to be too loud. Okay, I'm going to respond in order they were given. And I'm going to respond rather quickly. Steve Hayward. I mean, he never really had a real negative question, so I have to thank him for his kind words. But I agree with him about the nature of what is going on here. That I'm trying to create a new model of political science. In other words, by using Aristotle's conception of politeia, or the regime, or the political system, or what I call it, as the kind of lens, the framework by which we can now engage in understanding political things. Not only for any time, but in a way that we can look at it in a way that is, to use a philosophy term, phenomenological. In other words, I'm giving it the politeia offers a phenomenological lens to observe human social institutional phenomena in order to allow us to look at the different varieties of form and type of the different actual political systems that people live in and how they achieve it. In many ways, and therefore I think, yes, Ed Mansfield was one of my heroes, okay? And I think this is a part of an attempt, my attempt to kind of, I have to agree with Peter, Steve, that political theory is dying, not only in America, but in Europe. And it's dying because of postmodernism. The postmodernist and postmodernist positions won. And what happened was that we become anti-rational. That philosophy becoming anti-rational and attacking reason, ultimately allows us to study whatever we want. We can, like what happens in literature studies, that we can, the methodology allows us to deconstruct the text to how the hell we want, because there's no there. There's no text there. It is that the text is nothing but our will, of our own imagination. And what I'm doing is I may be a throwback. I'm a reactionary. I think there needs to be some objective reality. There has to be some axis, even though we approach it through different perspectives. The fact that we need common reference points in order to communicate, in order to measure, in order to do anything, gives us our level of objectivity. Therefore, I therefore take myself as not only as a political theorist, a political philosopher, but someone who cares about science. And maybe science, not in the narrow sense as the English tradition understands it, in this kind of reductionistic view, but more in the German tradition of the idea of science as a collective whole, where the human sciences and the social and the other sciences have some frame of reference that is universal, like the Greeks did. The Greeks understood science not as something that the human things and the material things we're still under the scopes of what they would call science. Now, of course, they understood science very narrowly at one level, because they would argue that reason itself, science as the term episteme would normally refer to, would be such a limited understanding of deduction and rationality, that the type of reasoning that deals for human things, particularly in terms of action, would be, phonesis, these kind of things. So, but real political science would require us to kind of return something to it, not necessarily using our desire to use rational models in order to understand human phenomena, giving us an objective standard. Therefore, a political science that is able to withstand the critique of modern philosophy and modern science. That we're not going to, of course, no level of pure objectivity can be reached. True. But that doesn't mean we have to throw the baby out without the bathwater. Our goal should be that we should be objective as possible. We should try to offer a means by which we allow an access to truth, access to understanding that all can participate in. And therefore, this is science. This is what science should be understood as. Now, in response to Dr. Filipowicz, I think this in some way answers this kind of question too. Because I think your big question is, what direction are we going to go? Are we going to go this incremental kind of instrumentalist way, or we're going to have the broader thing? I would answer both. You'd have to do both, because the only way, like Aristotle teaches us, and as Socrates teaches us, in order to get to the whole, we must start at the beginning. And the beginning is opinion, doxa. We start with the doxa. We test the truth that is, the true things that are imminent and immediate to us, and then only as we expand the ladder of truth to the truths that are universal and everywhere. Therefore, this is what science, as we understand it, tries to get the true things that are universal and everywhere. But what happens in modern science, because it demands this highest level, that the phenomena we deal with does not accept it. It either forces us to falsify the phenomena we're dealing with into that kind of measurement system, or we have to change in other words, we have to change the instrument we're using in order to understand the type of phenomena we're trying to measure and understand, experience. So therefore, this is what I mean by the idea why I think this regime science gives us a way to do this. Another point now goes to trying to keep everyone in tie. I want to get your name wrong. I'm trying to remember names now. Your comment. Your comment. Your specific. Szutta, Professor Szutta. Particularly your critical remark. I have to address your second remark for a second. The reason why politeia cannot be explained as political community is because politeia is the form a community takes. Therefore, to call it the community, we're talking about communities. The political form we are talking about is political communities. What the politeia allows us to do is to differentiate between different political communities, because human beings are so variant and different and heterogeneous. There's going to be also there cannot be a homogeneity of political form. That would be tyranny. And by the way, this is why the modern state is tyrannical, because it's by its very constructual nature of how it's desired, by basing it on human will, must be homogeneous in its construction, and must insist on this. Therefore, the very construction of the modern state was, in fact, a false turn, a mistake. Even though it may be useful, even though it may have produced very good benefits, the assumption about the nature of political things that it forces on us, it forces us into a very dangerous phenomena that we face. And this is why I would argue, I've been dealing with two books. I've been struggling with two people in my life, in my thinking. That is Aristotle and Hobbes. And I've been spending at least over 15 years trying to get a Hobbes book done, because I think Hobbes is probably the most fundamental theorist of our modern state. But at the same time, he's the most slippery son of a bee, because every time I think I got him, I think, he's not there. And this is something that drives me crazy. So every time I make some progress with Hobbes, I end up discovering new things in Aristotle. And this is what I discovered about sovereignty in Hobbes. I introduced the book about the point about sovereignty here. Now back to your other question, your critical comment. Okay, why Dahl? I think participate. It's not so much my criticism is about intensity of participation, but rather Dahl's use of, he switches his frame model from participation as an assumption to democracy. He and what's the other guy I mentioned there? I'm trying to remember, not the famous Tully, Charles Tilly. Now, what Tilly does is takes democracy itself, the concept of democracy, a regime, and uses it as a frame of reference. And by doing that, therefore, that rigs the deck. In other words, how can you have a frame of reference, a tool to measure something that is itself one of the outcome possibilities? Okay. Therefore, if you're going to have a measurement tool, the measurement tool cannot necessarily be, the thing or a form that you're dealing with itself. It cannot be, it's democracy, non-democracy. And therefore, this is the limitation of Dahl's model, is it's too simplistic. You either have your choice between democracy and non-democracy. Now, of course, the modern state likes this, because as Tocqueville shows at the end of his Democracy in America, there's only two political forms. It's about oligarchy. Yeah, because his idea is, but in his last book, he abandons polyarchy. His last book, he kind of goes full, before his 1999 book, Democracy, where he kind of, yes, I thought these things, but now let's embrace democracy totally. See, Dahl's a very difficult character because he keeps on changing his position over time. That's, by the way, why the earlier thing about participation and not democracy. He purposely changes the terminology of his frame reference to democracy because he made a move and didn't bother telling you that or telling anyone else that. Okay, and I think this is the other point about this whole question of how do we understand this thing. And I think this is why we have to understand that if we're going to have a frame of reference, a regime structure that measures, an instrument of measurement, it needs to be one that allows us that it doesn't promote a political form. This is why we go back to Tocqueville's famous, before you erase that point, Tocqueville says your choices are between democracy or despotism. Well, I'm sorry, that's a very not accurate form, because I don't know about you, but I look at Iran. I see a democratic system that is both democratic and despotic, and that the Tocqueville system does not. That simple dichotomy of that Tocqueville insists on doesn't offer you a means to understand that regime.
Well, to be more exact, you have a choice between, in the modern world, you have a choice between a democratic republic or a democratic despotism.
Yeah, exactly. But that's an additional level that his original twofold model at the end of the first part of the first volume leave us off as. Now, I want to then turn quickly to Professor Żyro's point, and I have to plead guilty here. I'm going to plead guilty. Twofold. One is guilty because of the second part, Alasdair MacIntyre. I have a love and hate relationship with Alasdair MacIntyre. I loved what he did with his after virtue and everything after that. This kind of model of reasoning, but Alasdair MacIntyre is still a diehard Marxist. he's still ultimately, his understanding of this is very much a communitarian. His turn to communitarianism is to make up for his hardcore Marxism of his youth. Yes, he uses Catholicism as kind of a frame. And probably this is the other part of the mea culpa, is I may have a negative view of Catholicism because I'm Protestant, okay? I come from a Protestant tradition, and therefore my lens, and also having to deal with Tomasz, if anyone knows what Providence College is or Rhode Island, it was run by the Dominicans, still is. And therefore I was shoved more Thomas Aquinas in my youth. And I think two semesters of St. Thomas, Summa, I left there with the resolve that this, too much of a thing, you just come to it. So I'm okay. I might have overstayed. I might have been a little less charitable to Thomas, but I think one needs to be, because I think in many ways Thomas himself has a problem, and this is something I addressed in my other book, and I didn't feel like I needed to address here, and that is that Thomas has no Greek. He's reading Aristotle wholly through Morbic's translation, and Morbic's translation has lots of mistakes in it. And therefore, he fudges some things. He fudges, we have the whole discussion of the mixed regime that we get in, which really is reflecting not in Aristotle's text, but something that's reflecting in the medieval interpretation of the time arising out of him. So there's a big problem there, and I think you're right. And I would say mea culpa, but that's a bigger question than the scope of what I was trying to do here.
I alluded to the considerable lapse of the Middle Ages.
Yes, and that's because the problem with the Middle Ages is that the Middle Ages creates a world where there's too many competing forms. You have too many competing forms. You have the feudal system is the rule of the household on a political level. Therefore, you have the church as a political system, using its a thing. You have principalities and households, which are, remember, principalities and baronies and these things are nothing more than extensions of household. And therefore, we run into a problem of the concept of kingship in the Middle Ages. The concept of kingship has the concept of paternalism, the father's rule. And this is not Aristotle makes it clear that political rule differs from kingship and family rule because politics is a level of equality where both parties must benefit. Where kingship, by its being the variety of paternalism, means that it's for the sake of the ruled, whereas the mastery is for the sake of the ruler. So therefore, this is the distinction of why in the Middle Ages you have all these competing systems, all these competing structures, the chaos of it. So one can understand why Machiavelli's state was essential. Machiavelli's creation of the state was a very essential moment to kind of put an end to all this mess that was happening because there's not one form. There's not an authoritative form that is able to speak for the political. Because what happens in the Middle Ages is kind of like the postmodern problem. There's no one unitive form of authority. There's competing forces of authority, all claiming they are equally valid and supreme. And this is a problem of the collapse of empire that happened because of what happened with Rome's assertion of political dominance and hegemony on that situation. So
paradoxical similarity between the late postmodernism and the Middle Ages, and some authors speaking of the new Middle Ages.
Yes, but last but not least, Peter. Peter, thank you, because we've known each other. Peter is also not only I reviewed his book translation back when it first came out, the first translation, his politics translation, back in 1994, wasn't it? Was it right?
1997.
Yeah, 97. And I was one of the few reviewers who was nice. I think I was one of the few reviewers who were nice to it, wasn't I? I think there's a couple other people who were, but no, I mean, other people were, but it got so nice that when I discovered 10 years later, your publisher decided to put my blurb without my name on the back of the book. So I was like saying, "Whoa!" because it was the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, the review. So, I mean, we've been friends, and people we've known each other's work and the ways we're going. And I think you're right. The problem here is that I think you go too far here about that all modern form is going to be oligarchy, because I would argue that I think the question is twofold. Not only structure, because I think we have to be very careful here to assume that Aristotle does not know representative government is possible. Because he makes it clear that the deliberative element, in his book 4, I think the last, was it 15, 16, so 414, where he talks about the deliberative element. There he mentions that the deliberative element can either be an assembly or it also could be elected representatives. And it still could be, yes, in structure oligarchic, but in practice and purpose democratic. So that's that. But I think that is. This is very much, I think the problem here is much of Aristotle. See, the problem with the politics always is that it's so, he never really kind of gives you a final version of the body things. He's letting you think through all the things. And you have to think through all the forms. And if you take the problem with the modern state, as long as we don't accept the concept of the state as, the problem of the difference between the state and the society, which is all, it's a big mess for this. Aristotle does not have a concept. The Greeks don't have any concept of society. They don't have the state, nor they have the society. The state and society occurs at the same time in us, Western thought. Before, you have societas in Latin, but that does not mean society as we understand it. It meant an organization, a community structure. Whereas the way we understand society is synonymous with the concept of the state. Hannah Arendt made this point, and many people of this point saying that these concepts occur around the same time. And I think it's because of the fuzziness of these two concepts and the interdependency and interconnectedness in modern thought of the state and society as a concept has really not been addressed properly by anyone. And I think this is a problem, that until we address that, maybe our understanding of the state itself is problematic. And maybe there needs to be, therefore, maybe until we have a good understanding of that, then, why not treat it as something little less homogeneous in structure and take the Aristotelian frames and looking at the parts, look at the parts of the structure, look at examine each state as though the parts, look at where the origins of the parts came from, its ways of life, which way of life is dominant in each group, which forces are armed, which one has the authority to hold it together, which ones do lack the authority. Look at, and therefore have a dynamic ability to examine a situation in a framework that does not impose upon it our Western or developed theories of what a state should look like. And this is very problematic with development theory. If you look at most development theory tends to impose a state structure and capitalist economic model as the only frame of development possible. Only. And therefore everything is merely this process. Not taking into consideration that may not be possible in those environmental circumstances. And to accomplish that, like turning Arabia into a modern nation state, listen to this. If we look at Western European history, Spain, making Spain into a nation state probably cost 250,000, maybe 300,000, maybe up to 1 million lives. France, the same thing. The genocide, the linguistic and regional genocides that occurred in the creation of the nation state is something we should not necessarily, are we going to be willing to allow to put up with similar kinds of bloodletting in Africa, in Asia, and in the Middle East that would be required if they would follow the pattern of Western Europe? I mean, I don't think none of us want that. So therefore, we instead of enforcing a system that would probably require such things, We might have to look at political phenomena in a way to allow us to find a system that the political form can develop within their context in a way that does not require the violence or the damage done that would be done by most models that the modern democratic theory brings upon. And that's why. And I think this is why I had to go beyond political theory and bring in the comparative politics models, because this is why it's such an important thing. And what's so amazing about this is if you look at there was a book where they interviewed all the major thinkers of the comparative political science movement. It's a very good book. They interviewed. Yeah. It's a very good book. There's interviews. They interview them, and it's being interviewed after they're in their 90s and something. And they, the major founders all admit, Aristotle was the most important book. Then why did you bother teaching it? They all even Huntington was praising Plato. And my response was, well, why didn't you fight or insist on keeping political theory requirements at the graduate level? Okay? In other words, you marginalize political theory as something, you should know this already from your undergraduate experience, which is not the case. And what happens is that students often, when they're exposed in an undergraduate environment to any of these key texts, they're ignorant of them, and therefore they remain ignorant. And what's even funnier is that they're ignorant of their own tradition. You can ask almost every comparative politics person today, ask them, do they know who Charles Merriam is? Or Harold Laswell? And they'll look at you as who? What? And I suspect they'll think about the same thing with Gabriel Almond, and about 20 years from now, people will say, Gabriel Almond, who's he? Who's Robert Dahl? They'll know the modern guy. They'll know there's some guy who's doing it now. But and this happens also, by the way, in the sciences. The ignorance of the scientific models of the past. When you study science now, you only study, you just mention Aristotle and stuff like that. Or you mentioned D. Galen or biology. You mentioned stuff that you don't bother to read them. So this is a kind of, they are forgetful of their own traditions. And this is why I kind of did this kind of thing on this point. On this point, I will shut up and give it to other people, and maybe people would want to reply. Before they turn, then maybe would someone like to reply?
For those unhappy few of you who never attended Professor Bates's lecture, they're Socratic, which means they always take longer than scheduled, and Professor Bates always assumes the role of the gadfly. So he bites everyone in their behinds. Catholics, communitarians, Tocquevillians, Statists, only Aristotle saves his bacon, and this is on a good day. So now let me allow our guests to bite back a little bit. Well, in the sitting order. Let's go in the sitting order. Just briefly.
Okay, I will go back.
We'll have a problem with the foreign guests. We're going to let ourselves here. I'm sorry, foreign guests. We're not going to have a chance to reconnect people. So
one point that I would rather stay with political community than regime. And your point was you can take something out as an abstract, and you can use the concept.
No, but political
applying to many different.
No, but political community is the thing itself. It's the polis. It's the community. But you can't. In other words, you're calling the thing that differentiates the thing we're examining. And I think that's. In other words, you're asking us to talk about this term. Use the term that is about the thing we're looking at, and then versus the politeia is the instrument that allows us to.
I understand your point, but my point is that this is abstraction, and abstraction is always simplifying. And if you take communities as they are full of elements. You say communities are not one unified thing. There are lots of elements which are hidden, at least at first sight, you can see them. So once you go to abstract, you might lose the opportunity to analyze those hidden elements in parts. So that's why I will say I have little time, so I will not develop this point. Another point that my critical remark was about, let me go back to why you would refuse democracy or putting democracy into typologies, because that would be biased in a way, while, let's say, political, which is normative, is not being biased. I think I have the point that maybe the word democracy is being understood in many different ways by many people, and now we don't know what we are talking about using the same term. And some people define democracy in such a way that it means political in Aristotelian sense, that we have the element of negotiation, or actually reasoning and trying to convince by reasoning, and we give speech to others, the free speech as the element of what I would call the ideal political system. And this is what many people mean by democracy. They mean deliberative democracy. They don't mean just the vote of majority.
Well, I'm sorry, the problem with that term is that the history of the term defeats that.
Well, we can postulate a new meaning and then we can debate, but because of the time I will not develop this point. Now, a new point, which was not mine, but some of you mentioned that nation-state versus politeia. I agree that politeia does not have to be a nation regime using military knowledge. I agree that that's true, but there could be politeias which are based on nations, and of course in Polish we have this distinction: political nation and ethnic nation. You would say the people and the nation for this distinction, but I can understand that nations are very useful tools for building political communities, because nations already have something which is necessary for politeia, for people to feel identity with their common, with their citizens, brother, sister citizens, whatever you call them. And why reject it once it is installed in some places of the world? The argument that ethnic communities lead to violence, it might be convincing in some parts of the world, not in others. The US are the nation in political sense, and they had their own domestic war. It also costed a lot of people. It was not based on ethnicity. It was based on some ideas which differentiate people.
Ways of life.
So I would say many differences lead to violence, not just ethnical differences.
Oh, no, exactly.
So maybe we could be more polite to nation states, a little bit more welcoming. Thank you.
All of you see how can I resist the deluge with only a few words. So let me give two short comments from the history of ideas point of view. I am, first of all, it's worth reminding that Wilhelm de Merbeke's translation of the term of politeia means communitas perfecta, and he tried to explicate that matter and form fused by causa efficiens, by the common good, which is the efficient cause for the political community. And the second remark comes from the political philosophy. I am not that sure that Aristotle would have been ready to say that doxa emanates from aletheia emanates from doxa, which means that this kind of episteme of the political is quite different. There's a deep divide between aletheia, level of the aletheia, and doxa. Thank you very much.
All right, so coming back to this dilemma, we are trying to consider, to put in light of our discussion. I think that, of course, understanding must be somehow related to reality.
Yes.
Of course, but in terms of prioritizing, I would say that we must start with understanding that it's not necessary to accept the obligation of being able to be in reality with the whole our knowledge from the very beginning, and to be practical in this very demanding sense. So I agree that we share certain responsibility, and it's of course about being rational, but in what sense? Again, I think your book, I read this in this way. is about the insufficiency of language. And this is the key point in my approach and in my effort to find a sort of inspiration in studying not only Aristotle but in approaching history. And I think that I would like to agree that we are becoming irrational because everything is divided and we have too many divides. Because, our knowledge comes with the language, so we can shape, we can create this perspective of commonality, common understanding. And I think that, at least in Europe, this tradition that is symbolized by the notion of hermeneutics is very important as the point of reference, and it's something embracing at the same time the problem of understanding and the problem of being effective in inspiring this type of knowledge, which is necessary in the field of politics and in the field of teaching political science, because of course we must deliver certain communicative skills to our students. And I share this concern, and I very like your belligerent conclusion that is at the very end of the book. We must rebel, probably that's the right moment. Thank you.
And let's turn it to the students.
Let me finally give a chance to the audience, give the audience a chance to ask some questions.
No, we're going to the audience. I mean...
Yeah, so, unfortunately, we'll leave our foreign guests mute due to technical difficulties. We'll pass on the voice to the audience. Any questions?
Richard.
Inescapably today, one has to remember that history has been made. The Brexit Article 50 has been presented to Mr. Tusk, and the talk of Machiavelli made me recall the role that Machiavelli had in the defense of the Republic of Florence when the two Medici cardinals went to Rome and begged Julius della Rovere, Pope, to provide them with an army. And Machiavelli was, in order to restore their power to Florence and remove the Republic, which Machiavelli, of course, was given the task of defending at Prato. He failed. Now, I'm just wondering whether this postmodernism, whether you can see a parallel here. Should the non-Brexiteers in Britain go to Mr. Tusk and ask him to provide them with an army to restore freedom to Britain?
An interesting one. Other questions? Let's gather a few of them.
Hello, Professor. First of all, I'm a Humphrey student from here, so pardon any possible ignorance or misunderstanding.
He's a student who's not humble.
I'll take that as a compliment.
Yes, of course.
In one of your responses, you illustrated us with France and Spain as examples of the rise of the nation states in the Western civilization, and you said that these bloody revolutions, which included genocide, were not the optimal, to put it lightly, would not be the optimal, to put it lightly, method of installing the nation states within African or Middle Eastern countries. And I would ask you if there's any kind of Western nation that has historically experienced the arrival of the nation states in a positive light. Could we? Well, obviously we cannot use the model of the United States because there is certain pre-existing conditions within African and Middle Eastern nations that wouldn't allow us for that pure Tocquevillian arrival of civil society. But, for example, we could look at the British model as the relatively bloodless arrival of the Western nation states.
That's
Not a very interesting question. One would wonder whether any political form can arrive without violence.
Yeah.
Other questions? No? We're done here? Okay.
Okay, but you kind of dismissed Professor Simpson's remark.
Which one?
The last one we discussed about the relevance
Okay, but
of Aristotle today, right? That probably
that he would consider it.
Aristotelian terms, right? I mean, he's not going to say a lot to us moderns or post-moderns because we are on the wrong side of history, right? And the only way for us would be, in order to recreate this true, genuine, natural communities, would be to live in communities that Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
No.
So we would need to get much smaller.
No.
How about multi-million people? Societies, countries.
I'm gonna interrupt you here because I think the problem here is we're assuming something, that the nature of a community in Aristotle's conception was that they needed to be able to communicate. People had to be able to communicate and understand each other. The problem is technology changes things. Technology changes the environment.
But also complicated.
So I'll give you the mic in a moment and then we'll answer. I think we're more or less done with the audience questions at this point. So passing out the mic to you, and we have 3 questions.
No, I mean, I'll start with the last and go backwards because I think the problem here is we have to understand that technology, even the understanding of how community itself, human beings are not only biological entities, but they also have to react to their environment. And our environment also shapes how our natures and our behaviors will operate. Technology changed us, and it changed our space-time relationship. The space-time of the early man, without automobiles, without transportation, without mobile, was a very small world. And therefore, if we look at the Greek world, right? The Greek world, it was oral. Yes, there was some writing, but it wasn't not necessarily for mass communication. Only with the creation of the Gutenberg press did nations become politically viable. Okay, technology made the nation possible. Without the Gutenberg press, there would never Aristotle and all the Greek world would argue that nations aren't. They knew about nations. They just thought they weren't politically viable because you couldn't have politics was not possible because it was just too large. And that is because of the fact that we communicate the way communication and knowledge, information flow. So therefore, inside Aristotle's understanding of what forms a political community is a theory of political communication that is changed by technology. Now, once we add internet and a global instantaneous communication, our notion of what is a community becomes a much more diverse and possible situation. In this way, in many sense, remember, communities are twofold. They're both voluntary and involuntary. They're both voluntary in that sometimes we're born into them, but sometimes we enter into them because we choose to enter into them by choice. Okay? And therefore, the nature of communities and the formation of communities, and this is why what's his name, Benedict, imaginary communities, I think
Benedict Anderson.
Yeah, Benedict Anderson. He hit on something, but he got it wrong. Because I would argue that he's right that this idea, this is not something new. This is always there. The question is, what's going to happen is we're going to be forming communities that are based upon the people who we share our lives with. How do we share a life with? And as the technologies shape how we live our lives, redefines how we live our lives, this will reshape what our politics is. So therefore, in this sense, if we understand that that the world we live in, the community that is formed, is going to be shaped as much by the way technology affects us. This forces us to rethink what is meant by the political community. So therefore, you're saying we have to go back to these little small communities. Well, that would be true if we were living in a world without communication. Now, I would argue that technology makes possible an Athenian democracy. Like Benjamin Barber makes this point, has always made this point. And also, there's this the prince of what's his name? This guy who loves the participatory democracy, who's he's the only last lane medieval prince who's still in Europe. Liechtenstein's president. Liechtenstein's president has a very good book about democracy and argues for radical participation democracy. Okay, so therefore he's arguing kind of Rousseau, but in a kind of a different way than we would. But the argument here is that okay, Rousseau, yes, but not in the way Rousseau meant it. Rousseau, we would have communities, we would have cities, and we would have these things, but they won't necessarily form this framework of this. We have to look at this more fresh. We have to be willing to see that technology does change the equation. So therefore, we don't have to go back to the medieval. We don't have to go back to policies. We can accept the reality of the diverse forms we have and try to achieve order. Try to see how we form communities and how we can have a healthy political form in this. And therefore, there's going to have to be different varieties of communities that emerge, and they're going to shape and form. They're going to want to live together. And now who is the second question? Second question about the bloodiness of it. Yeah, the problem is bloodiness is always with politics. You can't escape bloodiness. Politics is both. We have to be careful because politics is both voluntary and involuntary. It involves speech, yes, but it's not only speech. It involves us to achieve mutual benefit by argument, by persuasion. But sometimes, sometimes some people won't listen, and the collective good, the common good, requires some coercion be applied to them. The difference between the modern experience is often it was just too bloody, and I think the problem here is that maybe we need to be careful. The attempt to bring imposed states on the developing world may actually just produce much more bad conditions. And the English colonial tradition, no matter how wonderful it was, one can argue it was the least bad. It was the least bad of the imperial types of rule. There were worse. The English tradition is probably the least bad. The problem with this is, okay, it's a big problem that we have to look at that. When did these structures happen to each other? In other words, political development is not going to be happening on a uniform theme. This is what's wrong with Fukuyama's end of history nonsense. It assumed a unidirectional construction of development. Well, the problem is that that's not true. That human history, different parts of the world are at different states of human development. I'm sorry, Saudi Arabia is still stuck in the 12th century. It is slowly becoming 16th century as this new king creates an army under his own control and then does what Ferdinand did to Spain. Okay?
And I used to thought you were Austrasian, and now you're entering the historicist.
No. But that's the thing. And the last point, to your Richard's comment.
Modern point of view.
Yeah, it is modern, yes. I think maybe the ancient and moderns may be overstated in some sense. Stanley Rosen used to joke that Plato was the first modern. But to your point about Brexit and the question of Brexit, I think one of the biggest reasons why Brexit happened was that the failure of the European Union to face that it was a political project, and it failed to get consent of the population. It created an elite. It created a political elite that had uniform interests, but it didn't create a demos that had uniform interests. It didn't even bother shaping a demos. All of its programs aimed at shaping an elite. Socrates, I'm sorry, the Socrates program never really was aimed at the working classes. It was aimed at the university classes who are basically the elite. So therefore, this was elite, creating a common elite. And Aristotle makes it very clear. What happens when you create a factional conflict between an elite that has more in common with aliens and the demoses that have nothing in common with them, and they view them as enemy aliens? And you foster civil strife. And the European Union, by the way it did this, only fostered collective civil strife in its domestic spheres, without creating any attempt to create the thing. And I make a joke about this. I said, I remember at a conference when the Green, who's the Green, the German Green? No. The minister who was Fischer. Fischer was always walking around with his pocket of the Federalist Papers, saying that I've read the Federalist Papers, and this is when they were making the Constitution in 2002, 2001, right? I read the Federalist Papers, and I was at a panel, and I said, sorry, you didn't. Because the whole European Constitution was not the Connecticut Compromise. The plan of Europe was more like a thing called the New York Plan, which would be that the big states crushed the small states. Which was an idea, okay, that never had any. That Roger Sherman killed. It wasn't the Virginia Plan. It was that the European Union didn't even bother to look at the American experience of forming a union. It ignored it, and instead it went on the worst possible course by creating an administrative union that had nothing in common with this. And I think this is This has always been the sad tale, and I think this is why maybe we can say the Brexit happened was that it was, and I think why I think Le Pen may win. I think you will see the return of the political. This is what Pierre Menat makes up. That there's the attempt to escape the political is a folly. It will only lead to the return of the political. But the problem with the return of the political in this case is that it will come with teeth, and it won't be done by the most nicest people.
It's going to be a backlash.
Yeah.
Well, so we're reaching an interesting conclusion here that even those of us who are prepared to defend the nation state as the Pierre Menat need to realize that some compromises and some innovations are in order as far as the science of regime is concerned, and above all, the practice of regimes, because as the Nobel Prize winner in literature points out very aptly, things, they are changing. So thank you so much for today. I'd like to thank our distinguished guest and Professor Clifford Bates.
And I'd also thank my American friends and the students who are here, but they were able to join us today, and hope everything works on this online, see how this experiment works. So also in the future, we'll try this again with other people and other projects. Thank you very much, and I thank you very much for your comments on the book.
Great pleasure.
Peter, I'll let you go. I'll have to talk to you because your signal is so weak.